Let us consider two labels, Shakespearean English and Shakespeare's language. These labels are usually used for the same thing, the language produced by Shakespeare. I'm not going to use the term Shakespearean English because it is less precise. Sometimes it is used not just for the English produced by Shakespeare, but the English of Shakespeare's time, much like Elizabethan English is regularly used to refer to the English generally used by the people in the period of Elizabeth I's reign, and not simply the English that the Queen produced. Okay, so what exactly does Shakespeare's language mean? Let's approach this question by way of another. What exactly might Jonathan's language mean? It means presumably the language that I produce. Now, some scholarly work today makes the assumption that around 90% of a person's language is spoken. If we think about this historically, that figure would be much higher because literacy rates were so low, paper was expensive and so on. You can imagine where I'm going with this. We don't have well over 90% of what Shakespeare produced in his lifetime. To be precise, a handful of Shakespeare's spoken sentences are recorded in a legal deposition of 1612, at the bottom of which we can see his signature. But his words are filtered through third-person report for a legal record. In the main, the label Shakespeare's language really refers to the small proportion of his language that survives, namely written texts that purport to represent, for the most part, the language that Shakespeare produced for his literary works. For a modern linguist investigating matters of our language and identity, that would be a ludicrously inadequate dataset on which to base any conclusions about Shakespeare the man, or at least his linguistic identity. In this course, whenever we use the label Shakespeare's language, it should be considered a kind of shorthand for this fuller meaning relating to his literary works. Let us reflect further on this fuller meaning. Firstly, remember that I said purport to represent. The question is this: how do we know that Shakespeare actually wrote those surviving texts? The answer is that we do not know, and particularly that we will never know for sure. There is no baseline truth that is available short of hopping into a car that can go back in time or some other time machine. The best we can do is make decisions based on the fragments of an author's language that remain. This is what authorship attribution scholars do. They analyse evidence for attributing certain works or parts of works to certain authors. For example, with respect to Shakespeare, this means first identifying patterns of language in texts that you are fairly certain are written by Shakespeare, perhaps, for example, because they were catalogued at the time or referred to by contemporary authors as having been written by Shakespeare. Then you look for those patterns in texts that you are less certain are written by Shakespeare. If those patterns are there, then perhaps those texts are also written by Shakespeare. Of course, that method has obvious difficulties. It will only ever be as robust as the assumptions one can make about that first data set really having been written by Shakespeare. Also, it will only ever be as robust as your ability to control for confounding variables. For instance, if your first data set has, for example, a large number of tragedies or a large number of high status characters, how can you compare the patterns you find in that data set with another data set that might have a different mix? Ultimately, we can only do our best. Interestingly, there is some overlap between the techniques authorship attribution scholars use to establish language patterns and those used in the area of linguistics that underpin this course, namely corpus linguistics. However, there are important differences. Authorship attribution scholars have what might be described as a sack of words approach to language. They might ask, what features pattern across the items in the sack and help characterize the contents of the sack overall? Is it the sack of potatoes filled by the potato farmer or the sack of flour filled by the miller? The linguist has more of a bag of ingredients approach to language. They might ask, how do the items in the bag combine in particular ways to create particular dishes? Do we have the ingredients for a lasagna, moussaka, roast beef dinner? Words work with one another in particular ways to co-construct meanings. meanings that convey particular messages when communicated in context. Who communicated them, Shakespeare or somebody else, is but one factor in the construction and interpretation of meaning. In this course, we will take much more the latter ingredients approach. Be prepared for much cookery. As a brief coda to this video, let me just say one thing. Don't assume that work by the attribution scholars is unimportant. Whilst it is not what we are focusing on in this course, any study that investigates Shakespeare's language will need to make decisions about the texts that can be said to be Shakespeare's language just to get started. So at least to some extent, we rest on the shoulders of the attribution scholars. We will return to this issue next week.